talk more about how law interacts with science, scientific community, indigenous peoples. And in telling that story, my title is like Native Title Law, Restrictions for Indigenous Peoples and Scientific Research. And it's When the Cure Kills. I think this is something that I need to emphasize here before I start my presentation, is that in 1993, when the Native Title Act was introduced in Australia, and it was considered as a significant achievement, particularly in relation to the recognition of indigenous people's rights to their traditional lands and resources. And the act was also considered, in fact, it is still being considered as a major legal measure to address the historical disposition of indigenous peoples from their traditional lands and resources. I also had almost a similar perception about the Native Title Act. But I think in today's talk and through my research, I will show that although the Native Title Act was considered as something like the cure, I think currently for many indigenous communities in Australia, it is operating more like a killing device. And it is just restricting indigenous peoples in a number of ways that is also impacting scientific research, including the research that we have been talking about since the morning. So historically, globally, people accessed, used, and researched plant genetic resources, seeds, germplasm, openly and freely, with few legal restrictions. In a way, there was no international law to regulate the access, use, and transfer of genetic resources, including seeds and germplasm. Things changed in 1990s when the Convention on Biological Diversity came into being as a UN treaty, as a treaty of the United Nations. So what the Convention on Biological Diversity did was it recognized that all states have their sovereign rights over their genetic resources. So which basically means that it is no more a commonly, openly accessible resource across the world. So states now have the power to regulate who and how one can access and use and research genetic resources. In recognizing state sovereignty, the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, made two significant contributions. First, it emphasized that all users of genetic resources must obtain prior informed consent from the providers of resources. Second, the Convention also emphasized that all users of plant genetic resources must conclude benefit sharing agreement with the providers of genetic resources. But in some ways, the Convention on Biological Diversity had certain limitations. And in order to address those limitations, then a supportive supplementary agreement, international agreement, was introduced in 2014, which is known as the Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing. Interestingly, after the enforcement of the Nagoya Protocol in 2015, now not just countries, but increasing scientific journals, universities, botanical collections, gene banks have also started to implement the core spirit of the Nagoya Protocol. For example, by developing guidelines around prior informed consent, benefit sharing with indigenous peoples and many other plant providers. In Australia is yet to ratify the Nagoya Protocol, but Australia is party to the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. And Australia, as we all know, Australia is divided into 6 sovereign states and 2 territories, but only in the Commonwealth areas, Queensland and then the Northern Territory. So far, there exist some laws in relation to access and benefit sharing pertaining to biodiscovery research or research on genetic resources, including native plants, native Australian plants. Since the 1990s to now, there have been several concerns about how access and benefit sharing systems have been impacting the community, the world. On the one hand, there are growing concerns that access and benefit sharing systems haven't resulted into any real and tangible benefits for indigenous peoples. So that remains still as a valid concern. On the other hand, there are also concerns that access and benefit sharing laws have restricted access to genetic resources and led to unwarranted administrative, legal, and financial burdens for private companies, universities, researchers, and many other organizations who are required to access and use resources. But through the work of this center, and the question that I'm trying to explore in this presentation is, but the question is, are the problems confined to access and benefit sharing laws? And in addressing that question, interestingly, through the work of this center, we discovered that indigenous peoples in Australia are not being able to receive real and tangible benefits. It's not just because of access and benefit sharing laws, it's also because of the Native Title Act. So, before I talk further about that conclusion, so as Asmina this morning mentioned, the ARC Training Center came into being in 2019. And since we're so serious and committed about indigenous engagement and how to work with indigenous partners and communities, so we formed, at the very beginning of the project, we formed an indigenous advisory board, which was supported by the formation of an indigenous enterprise group, which includes all of our indigenous partners who are collaborating with us through the center. Then we also obtained ethics approval for the center, for center's research with indigenous partners as well as industry people and several other stakeholders. And then, but ethics approval was not sufficient for us to guide how to work with indigenous partners and how to respect their rights in relation to access and benefit sharing that has been recognized in some parts of Australia and internationally. So, together with the Indigenous Advisory Board and with comments from several indigenous partners, we also developed several policies and procedures of working with indigenous partners and communities. And we also developed model agreements for the collection and use of plants from indigenous partners and communities. And all these documents are publicly available on the website of the training center. So you can, if you want to go into the details of what these policies are, what these model agreements are, please visit our website. So after we developed all these policies, procedures, and we started negotiating with indigenous partners, taking their inputs about how we can work with them, it took quite a good amount of time for us to establish that connection and build that trust about which we were talking this morning between the indigenous partner, and the center people. In 2019 or so, we also I was personally involved in a PhD research project, which required to collect some samples of Burdigan plum from indigenous land in Australia. So we started negotiating for the collection of Burdigan plum samples in Queensland in 2019. And then in the course of that negotiation process, there were several questions and concerns that we got from our indigenous partners, like who will collect the plant materials, who is going to commercialize the plant materials, what will happen after I give our plants to you, what you will do with our plants, what you will do with the products that you may derive out of these materials. There are so many concerns and issues that our indigenous partners raise in relation to commercializing and intellectual property. And also, specifically in relation to intellectual property, they also wanted to know who is going to own the material that they would provide to us, and then who would own the derived product that may come out of the project. Although it was just a PhD project, it didn't have any commercialization intent, but still it was it was very fruitful, productive for us to discuss all these questions and concerns with our indigenous partners. And because we had already developed our policies that the ARC Training Center will not claim any intellectual property over the collected materials, nor will transfer collected materials to any third parties without the consent of the indigenous partner. And if in case any intellectual property arises out of the project, it will be owned by the indigenous partner. So all these things were already addressed in our policies, and which really helped us create a dialogue with our indigenous partners and eventually also build some kind of trust between us. And I think it still remains as a fantastic experience for me. So based on these policies, our regular meetings, workshops, eventually we came up with a draft benefit research agreement in which we included all the terms and conditions of access to research samples. We also talked about benefit sharing, like Anne just mentioned about chemistry toolkit. But we said that, okay, because you will be giving us plans and then we'll be conducting research on your samples, so we would also like to do some education and training program for you, including the distribution of this training on this chemistry toolkit that you can use to test your native plants and foods, and there were so many other benefits, like education and training programs were also conceptualized to help the community improve the value chain of the budding plant. But despite several months of negotiations and despite reaching an agreement to sign the agreement for collecting and using budding plant for scientific research, eventually we couldn't sign the agreement with the community. Initially, I was really heartbroken because Yasmin and I, getting, all of us were so much involved in the process, and I was just shocked, like, how come all of the sudden then we can't do this agreement with the community. But later on, I realized, and I learned so many things from that case, and which I initially used to call refer to as a failed case, but I have stopped saying that. It's not a failed case. It was a great learning project for me, for the center and for me. So what were the problems? Why couldn't we sign the agreement? And then we discovered that the problem was not with the terms and conditions of mutually agreed access and benefit sharing agreement, nor the problem was with the Queensland Biodiscovery Act, which regulates how people should be collecting plant genetic resources or other genetic resources within Queensland. There was no restriction from these laws, or there was no restriction from the terms and conditions that we discussed with indigenous communities. The problem was with the Australian Native Title Act, 1993. And eventually, we figured out that where native title exists, and then the Native Title Act was the major source of the problem, because when we were discussing with those communities, then the communities themselves, through the help of their native title representative body, discovered that they are only allowed to collect plants for personal, domestic, and non-commercial community-based purposes, but they are not allowed to provide samples as for research, or they are not allowed to use resources for commercialization or any other purposes. It's because under their native title determination, they didn't have exclusive rights over their lands and resources. They had non-exclusive rights. So in situations where native title exists with non-exclusive rights in Australia, indigenous peoples cannot provide research samples legally, I would say, in a strict legal sense, which means that this impedes scientific research, hinders food innovation, and restricts indigenous people's ability to benefit from the use of their resources. At the same time, this also undermines the principles and the spirit of the Nagoya Protocol, Convention on Biological Diversity, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, before I conclude, please pay attention to the map that I have kept here. So through this map, you can figure out in which particular parts of Australia indigenous peoples have exclusive rights over their traditional lands and resources, and in which other parts they don't have, and in some other parts they in fact they are still in the process of going through the native title and things like that. So the most of only in the Western Australia there are more indigenous communities who have exclusive native title rights that you can see the dark green ones. The light green ones, which are around the middle part of Australia as well as in Western Australia, that's where native title exists, but with non-exclusive rights. So they don't have exclusive rights over their lands and resources. So, and then the dark brown areas, native title doesn't exist, and in some other areas they have native title and have already extinguished. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that I think people have internationally and within Australia, people have discussed substantially about the limitations of HSN benefit sharing laws in relation to providing or ensuring benefits for indigenous peoples. Unfortunately, not much has been done in relation to laws like this, which severely restricts indigenous people's ability to use their resources and collaborate with scientific community or industrial community for the benefit of their community as well as for the benefit of Australia. And I think I don't want to conclude with a sad note, but I think because Yasmina said this morning that our journey will continue and then we'll come up with some newer programs and projects. So I think in future we'll have to tackle native title as one of the major issues within our research programs, and then try to work with indigenous partners to build further trust and partnership and tackling all these obstacles.